All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate session of the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative at Aspen Digital, which is the Aspen Institute's program on technology and media. And I am joined today by Allison McCauley to talk about the next generation of the web. Allison, it's hard to even know where to sort of sum up where we are as a society and our relationship with the internet and social media right now. But the promise of social media, the promise of sort of this digital life that seemed so bright in the end of the first decade of the 2000s with the Arab Spring and the rise of social media and sort of the sense that the web could be a force for good around the world has turned a lot darker over the last couple of years. And we have seen that in social media platforms. We've seen that in sort of the security of our online lives, as we've talked about over the course of this festival over the last couple of days. And I wonder if you, as someone who's sort of been involved in the modern internet for much of the period of which we would define the modern internet, if you could sort of talk a little bit about what you think the web got wrong as it came together in its original vision.
Thanks, Garrett, for having me. And it's really such an important question to examine. And when I came out of graduate school, it was before the dot-com boom, and there was so much excitement about this new open and permissionless place where we could all contribute to building. And I've been in Silicon Valley for 25 years as part of this evolution. And what was the core underlying infrastructure of the web is something that is publicly owned. We figured out how to evolve it and govern it with standards organizations so that there's no web CEO, there's no central organization that manages it. But what happened is when all of humanity collided with this new thing, and we understood more about how we want to use it, we needed new things. We needed things that weren't covered in the original design. So we needed a way to search this vast universe, right? So search engines were born. And we wanted so badly, not just to share data, but to share and connect our relationships and have a public square on the web. And so social media was born. And we wanted a way to share our data and our files and be agile about that. And so the cloud was born. So all these things were created, and Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs found that they could build these, fund them, and get all the returns from that. And when you look at it in very simple terms, it doesn't seem so bad. But what happened is that the economy that was built on top of this was a surveillance economy that was focused on data. And so over time, what happened is that's a very successful economy. So it essentially uses all of us and the data we produce to drive dominance. And so over time, almost the entire web is being siphoned up and subsumed by these dominant platforms. And what happens is when you get the collision of that and the power of that surveillance economy, combined with the fact that this has become our central on-ramp to this entire experience, how we consume it, it's a very dangerous combination. So if you look at, for example, in some countries, Facebook has made, has a relationship with phone companies so that if you get a new phone, Facebook comes preloaded, and it gives the impression that Facebook equals the internet. And so most of our activity is subsumed by this. And what's interesting is that the surveillance economy throws off this, it throws off this toxic byproduct that is really rendering us apart. And so you get these headlines, for example, in The Atlantic, there was an article that Facebook is a doomsday machine. That's very strong language. Or Amnesty International put out a report talking about how the business models of Facebook and other players are actually harming our human rights. So it's turned into something very, very different.
And some of that has come about because, in many ways, I think consumers still today don't realize what the economics of the web actually are. Yeah. That we have sort of gotten used to so many of these tools being absolutely free, and have sort of forgotten the maxim online that if you're not paying for the tool, then you are the product, not the customer. And that when we look at something like Facebook, whether we look at something like Gmail, whether we look at the Google search engine, we're using all of these tools for free because someone upstream is able to monetize our own data and turn that into something of value to advertisers down the road. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as you look out across today's status quo online, sort of how do you think it's broken, and sort of what is the path forward for fixing it?
Well, and to your point, we want these tools, we demand them, that's why they were created. And we believe we're getting value from it, but we're not necessarily seeing the trade-offs. We see them now, we've learned to see them in a more dramatic way recently, certain events such as what happened January 6th at the Capitol. But what we need to do is understand how it is possible to change the balance of power with these. So it's almost as if we have that frog in water where the water slowly turned up and we hadn't seen it happen until we're boiling. Now we are boiling. And so we need to understand that, and we're starting to see that the relationship that we have with central platforms is extremely uneven, extremely inequitable, and that there's a way to change it.
And building on that, sort of one of the things that we have become very sensitized to over the last 5 to 7 years, and particularly even just over the last 2 years, is the extent to which there are sort of biases and assumptions built into the underlying web that are not inclusive, that effectively these tools almost exclusively were built by white men, sort of for white men, as the ideal user. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about, as we think forward about what solutions should be, who needs to be at the table to consider the next generation of the internet who wasn't at the table before?
This is absolutely at the heart of it, and it's endemic. This is an endemic problem that I've seen since the beginning of my career in Silicon Valley. And what was built depended on who had access to capital, who had the networks where they could get the funding, that understood where to get the resources to build. And we need to, and I believe this can happen very effectively with open source tools, we need to open the playing field of who can build. We need to lower barriers for entrepreneurs so that any of us can create and remix and make new applications with ease that could have a chance of success. I look at how my children, even many years ago, for school projects, would just build a website. That's what they would do instead of delivering a paper. So it's become very easy for us all, for them to build a website. What if they could build a new application with such ease? So that's one piece of who's at the table. But what's also really important is that we have built technology historically by technologists. Now, why are we depending on technologists to build the foundation for our public squares that we all want to interact in? So what's happened over time, if you think about how this has evolved, is that code actually is governing our behavior in a way as much as laws. And yet, just a few people are designing that technology, relative few, designing that and launching it, and getting the financial benefit of that. Now, that is something that needs to change to be able to change the situation that we talked about earlier.
So, and this brings us to sort of what technologists are beginning to talk about as Web 3.0, sort of an era of the web over the next decade that is increasingly driven by the Internet of Things, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, and then also sort of just huge bodies of data that begin to be deployed in interesting and novel ways at speeds much faster than anything that we've seen thus far. And you're involved in a project that is sort of trying to begin to think about what that Web 3.0 could look like, called Project Liberty. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Project Liberty and sort of what the vision for it ends up being.
Yeah, there's a lot of different definitions of what Web 3.0 entails, but at the core of how I think about it is that there's new technology that's now available that is designed to actually change centers of power. So it offers us the ability to substantiate truth without needing to have a middleman in between. So this offers an opportunity to change the way things work. And so with this new technology, we can shift who owns the data. Is it a central company, or is it the people who created and produced that data? Who gets the value? So we can shift who actually gets the value from that data. And we can find new ways, and supports new ways to do community governance so that we can govern technology as a community more easily without a middleman, relying on a middleman to do it. And so when we talk about Project Liberty sees an opportunity to shift the way the web works by actually using our social networks as a key to unlock change. So our social networks are extremely powerful, and I'm not talking about social media as it's interpreted today. I'm talking about our networks of people and our relationships and the relationships we have at work, with friends, with our neighbors. These are very powerful, and so if we can find a way, which we've developed, to take our social networks and have that core functionality, not the proprietary technology of a private company, but to break that out and combine them to create a shared social network, or we call it is a social graph. That circuitry gives us immense power to create change. So with our work at Project Liberty, we've created this new infrastructure that is public infrastructure. It's based on technology that allows us to community govern our social networks, have the people govern that. And it gives us a foundation to shift the way who owns the data and who gets the value from the data. And so the next piece of that is then fostering an ecosystem of innovation on top. So to create services and applications on top and encourage others to diverse bodies of entrepreneurs and social innovators to create an innovation ecosystem on top that will attract people to using this social graph. And so this shared social graph can open the opportunity for us to have network effects without relying on a single app. This is where we can make this something that we all do together, and we can all work together to build better because it's an open architecture. We're not reliant on a company making a decision to build something. We can build it. We can contribute it to the ecosystem. But really fundamental to this is who's at the table that you were mentioning earlier about envisioning what this is. It is not just about having technologists at the table. We believe so strongly it needs to be ethicists, social scientists, economists. We need to have policy makers involved in actually rolling up their sleeves and helping us understand how to build and create this. This is a technology that we have learned over the past 30 years should belong to all of us. We should all be able to create on this. And so that's our work behind Project Liberty.
Just to rephrase, I think, a little bit what you're talking about. So if you think about the ways that different social media companies exist today, LinkedIn has sort of its body of data about you. Twitter has its body of data about you. Facebook has its body of data. and that there are both sort of not competitors to those widely seen, at least, and that data is sort of locked up in those platforms. That it is hard to take your data from Facebook and move it to another social media platform if one were to come about. And sort of part of what you're talking about is building what Project Liberty calls this decentralized social network protocol, I think. That's is what right. The phrase that you use. And so you're talking about sort of building an architecture of data where where services begin to compete as services on top of that, rather than sort of locking you away inside Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter. Is that?
Exactly.
Okay.
We don't own our relationships. They are, if you try to leave a Facebook or a LinkedIn, you can't take that with you. So this is about shifting that ownership so it's yours. And then, over time, we develop an open marketplace of services that sits on top. So for example, we are reliant today on private companies coming up with the services and algorithms that help us use this stuff. Curate feed algorithms, curation, moderation, personalization, that all comes from a private company. We don't get to have a say in it, except in small ways. What if we could what if the best thinkers around the world could come together to create the best feed algorithms that could be pro-social and support society as opposed to tearing it apart? If we had an open marketplace that everyone can contribute to, and then apps can pull that in and use it, then that opens up new potential. So the layers are this underlying, a protocol is simply an underlying infrastructure and standard that helps us all communicate. So you've got that piece, and then you have this new open marketplace on top of services and apps that lowers the barriers for entrepreneurs so it's easier to contribute. And that can open up, that can unlock so much potential. And the way that we think of our social networks today is very limited by the interpretations of a few companies. And so that's why we think of social networks and social media almost as synonymous. But really, what could we do with our social networks if we could unlock that? What kind of collaboration could we create if we were in charge of that? The kids in your community, what would they want to create for, what kind of new social network application? What would they want to create for their school? Where would we find the new breakout hits? What kinds of things could we do to spread the kinds of principles that we were talking about?
One of the things I'm always struck by as we sort of watch the sort of growth and longevity of these social networks. I mean, Facebook coming up for its earliest users, has been around for 20 years, or nearly 20 years. And thinking about sort of how your social networks and your social relationships change over the course of, many, many years. That, Facebook, which sort of starts as this, network of your college friends. I'm struck sort of logging in every day and looking at the list of my friends who have birthdays. How many of these people I don't actually really know anymore? And that there's a line about, Facebook is filled with people you're not really friends with, while Twitter is people you don't know who you're actually friends with. And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit philosophically about how you see, if there is an open architecture to our social graph and our social lives online, how does that change and how does that sort of evolve as people go through different chapters of their lives over, years and decades?
So there's the collective social network, or social graph, which is all of us, all our networks tied together. But there's also your own. So your own social networks, your own relationship, your own data. That is something that you keep in a vault, a wallet, that's yours. And you get to choose who you share this with or not. Which of your networks you're going to share. So imagine there's a new app. Let's say it's a new version of an app that we use today, and you decide I'm just going to share my work contacts with that. It's your choice. So you can set the rules. You can set the terms and conditions in this new vision.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open up to audience questions, and I'll ask sort of one more while people start thinking about questions. So what to you is what Project Liberty is building towards? Like what is the minimal viable product, as Silicon Valley would say, of what Project Liberty wants to deliver?
So I think those are two questions, because a minimum viable product is simply where we start. But where this is going is a foundation for a more equitable web. When we can change who owns the data, and we can change who gets the value, and we can change who gets to sit at the table and be a part of this, and build this, and create this, when this is ours, that's when change happens.
So what does minimal viable product look like for you, though?
That's a beta apps, and getting others involved to also create beta apps and services so that we can start evaluating these and learning from them. So, yeah.
Great. All right, questions from the audience about the future of solving the internet. All the way over here.
Hi, thank you. Great talk. I think this is a very important conversation. Seemingly, technology companies want regulation, and I'm curious why we have not seen regulators step in and provide us with up-to-date regulation on data and internet.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's such a big question, and so and I'm going to talk at a philosophical perspective. I'm not a regulatory expert. But what I'll observe for you is that the velocity of developing new tech is incredibly fast. So we have agile methodologies that help us iterate, learn, iterate so fast. And that has completely outpaced our institutional processes and ability to regulate. There is, if regulation starts to come in, I mean, tech can just change around that so fast. So what we need to do is find ways to resolve for a velocity mismatch. And I think it's really hard with regulation. And so we're also looking for ways to go from insight, from social science and other areas, and integrate that in policy and integrate that to how we build the tech, because we think that that can also help us find a way to go from insight to action more quickly. But it's a velocity, at the heart, I think it's a velocity mismatch. And that's why having the foundation for a new model gives us new opportunity that surpasses what's possible with regulation alone.
So let me sort of build on that question a little bit, because part of Project Liberty is you have a partnership with Georgetown and with Sciences Po in France. And one of the things that has been so fascinating to watch over the last 5 years is that the idea of the internet as a united global enterprise has basically collapsed. And what we're seeing now is the splintering of the global internet into really 3 different bodies. You have sort of a Wild West surveillance capitalism, anything goes US model of the internet. You have a authoritarian internet, largely growing out of China, along with other nations, Russia, increasingly some of the Eastern European nations, that much more limits free speech, political debate, stifles human rights reporting, and then you have sort of Europe in the middle here with creating a very different philosophical internet around sort of centering data privacy and user privacy under GDPR and Ireland's data regime and so on. And I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about how you see Europe approaching these questions differently from the United States.
Well, Europe is definitely advanced in their data protections. And so I think we have a lot to learn. And so we think it's really important to make sure that, when you asked about MVP, making sure that we're thinking about how do we evaluate with that lens, and how do we make sure that the work is at the highest level it can possibly be. And so I think we have a lot to learn from Europe, and and I think the U.S. has a lot to learn from Europe for that.
Let me take another question down here still, and then we'll go to the digital questions for a minute. So down here for first. Oh.
Thank you. Fascinating. So in terms of creating an equitable internet that protects people, how do we make it safe as well in terms of having consequence for bad actors, for racists, misogynistic language, violent language? How do we make sure that it is both open but also protective, and that there is, how do we keep the peace and keep people safe?
And you listed off a couple challenges, but there's 100 of them like this, and they're complex and they're really hard. And so what's fundamental is a shift from a closed proprietary way of trying to deal with this from single companies that are outpaced and overwhelmed by what's being thrown at them to something where we can all work together to build better and find better ways and actually employ those, start to use them. And so that's fundamentally where we need to go. And the reason that we also need to bring more people to the table is that technology answers alone aren't enough. You can't just figure it out on a whiteboard in 30 minutes and build it and have it work. We need to be able to have a forum to be able to integrate more. So there's work that's being done, but we need more of it.
So let me go to a digital question here for a second and then come back to audience questions. So Beth is asking about if you're looking for data liberty and equity, sort of what do we do to make Wi-Fi open and free to everyone?
Yeah.
Which I might sort of broaden out a little bit to ask more about just sort of online access, which, and you hear, folks like Mark Warner talk about, broadband as the railroads of the 21st century, that, if you're not online, economically, you're going to be left behind. And I wonder sort of how much you're thinking about this and how much role you see this as a private sector question versus sort of a government question.
Yeah, so opening up access, I think, is hugely important. And we can see some of the interplay when we look at, for example, with Facebook offers free internet service in exchange for Facebook being the lead of how you get onto the internet. And so you can see where those worlds collide, where the fact that we need to have access to the internet, we need to make that equitable, but if we don't, someone comes in and uses that to exert centralized control and dominance and surveil. So there's an interplay there. And in general, philosophically, our focus, the decentralized social networking protocol that you mentioned is something that's built as public infrastructure. So that is open source and available now. And it is gifted to the public for use. So that's something that we believe in.
So, all right, question back there.
Hi, I'm particularly concerned about the link between mental health and social media. And as I think about the problem of technologists not just being representative of our community, which is a problem, for example, in the development of AI technologies and potential bias embedded in them as a result, but that they're incentivized to make these technologies addictive and manipulative, right, in the realm of strategic capitalism. So how do we, other than completely abandoning the way in which these platforms are monetized, how do we get technologists to think differently, or at least incentivize them differently, to not create that like or that notification, to really make these platforms addictive and ultimately not great for our mental health?
So I think it does take a new model. And there's a great paper from 1975, oldie but goodie, and it is titled, "It's a Folly to Expect A and Reward for B." And so it's a folly for us to think that we'll have complete change with an existing model that is incentivized to drive algorithmic dominance, or dominance through algorithms in this way. And so a new model gives us opportunities to change that. And in the models that this new technology can support, we can set up ways for all participants that are adding value to be able to get value back from the system. So that's where the shift is, where it's not about outsize home run returns off a single company, but it's about how can we all share in the value that we're providing to a network. So if we're providing innovation to that network, how are we rewarded for that? If we're providing our own networks, or we're somehow participating, how do we get value for that? So that's where I see the change, and I do think it's fundamentally at the model level.
So, all right, I think we've got time for one more question over here.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I'm sure you're familiar with Apple's recent feature to ask if you want to share your data with the app that you're using and so forth. Is that a significant move? Is it too little, too late, lipstick on a pig? Like, how should a consumer think about that new effort?
Yeah, so there's a lot of pressure. There's this collective awakening from all of us that we want more, and this is a response to that. And I think that it's a move in the right direction. But as we were talking about, at the core, the incentives are misaligned. So I think it's really important if we think about this model, these models that we're talking about, carrying forward in the way they are, 10, 20 years, what is that trajectory? What's it going to look like? I have teenagers. What is their adult life going to be? And so that's why I spend my focus on this, is because this gives us new opening, a new way to unlock an alternate digital future.
Allison McCauley, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.